G'day folks, and welcome to this side-by-side comparison of Stalingrad 42 and For Blau. Stalingrad 42 was designed by Mark Simnich and published by GMT Games in 2019. For Blau was designed by Greg Blanchett and published by Compass Games in 2015. Now, they are both very similar games. They cover the same campaign. For Blau, Case Blue from June to December 1942. They have similar map footprints, similar scales, similar hex scales, similar gameplay. This video is designed to contrast the two. As always, the idea here is not to say that one is better than the other. It is really to highlight the differences in gameplay and feel and help inform your decisions. I spoke recently about how, for me, they are both keepers. They both are games that I am glad I own and will keep in my collection. They offer different things. They offer different feelings in the sense of their gameplay. So I'll say up front, it is worth getting both. But I'll talk more about the details and what may shift you one way or the other later on in this video. The first thing I want to talk about is complexity. They're both mid-weight games. They both have core rulebooks that come with the games. They both have released living rulebooks. The Stalingrad 42 living rulebook is about 32 pages long. It includes scenario notes and the like, but there's only about 24 pages of core gameplay rules in that rulebook. Likewise, For Blau has about a 45-page living rulebook with designer notes and scenarios, but again, there's only about 24 pages of core rules and clarifications within that rulebook. So they're both almost identical in terms of the scale of the rulebook. They are similar complexities. I would probably suggest that if you're new to both of these games, For Blau is probably the easier game to learn. But of course, Stalingrad 42 is part of Mark Simnich's 19XX series. So if you've played other 19XX titles, Ardennes 44 and the like, you'll more easily grasp Stalingrad 42. But there's very little to divide them in terms of complexity. Mid-weight games with a great depth. I would suggest in terms of gameplay length that For Blau is a longer game. It has more of a monster feel to it. There are a lot more units on the map, greater unit density. It appears bigger and it has that sort of grander scale, whereas Stalingrad 42 has probably, whilst a similar footprint, lighter unit density and faster gameplay, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. In terms of that map footprint, Stalingrad 42 is a more square design. It's about 120 centimeters, 48 inches by about 180 centimeters, 71 inches, whereas For Blau is longer and generally narrower, but there are it basically comes with 3 large maps, and the 2 additional maps that you attach to the side around the Caucasus region, that pushes its maximum width out to about 130 centimeters, and it's about 220 centimeters long, so much longer map footprint, about 87 inches long. Now, one of the most defining features which contributes to the different feel of these games is their scale. Stalingrad 42 has 10 miles or 16 kilometers to a hex. For Blau has 6.5 miles or 10 kilometers to a hex. So Stalingrad 42, the hexes represent 50% more area. Now, that's a critical factor. It's subtle, but it's critical because it affects movement, rates of movement, and what you're doing with your units on the map. The main unit for the Axis forces are divisions. So you're looking at panzer divisions, infantry divisions. Soviets are all over the place. As I said, a turn in Stalingrad 42 runs for about 4 to 7 days. Now, as I said, in For Blau, a turn runs for hex is about 6.5 miles, 10 kilometers. A turn is 3 days, and Axis units are principally infantry divisions or panzer regiments. And you combine the units of a named panzer division together to form a strong striking stack. So you've got the main effect of this is that you have a lot more units on the map. And this ties in with Mark Simnich's hex bond system, which also lightens the unit density in Stalingrad 42. So whereas, and I'll point this out in a moment, whereas in Stalingrad 42, you'll have a scattered front line of units spread out with gaps between them. In 4 Blau, you'll more often have a more solid front line of continuous and contiguous units along the front. That's what the Soviets will be striving for, and it has some pretty critical effects on gameplay and where you're striking, where you're looking to get things done. In particular, because you've got that solid front line in 4 Blau, it can be at times more work to push through Soviet defensive lines for the Axis player. But as a result, you're making more decisions. Where do you strike? Where do you focus your concentration of powerful units? In Stalingrad 42, because your units are spread out, you may have 3 Soviet stacks blocking, a 5 hex area. You're making more abstract decisions about how do I break that hex bond. If you take out that middle unit, you've created a big gap through the center that you can drive through. Just different types of decisions. You'll be engaging in fewer combats in Stalingrad 42 because you've got that 5 hex line being defended by 3 stacks, whereas that same 5 hex line in 4 Blau may be defended by 5 separate stacks of Soviet units. You need to push all 5 out of the way to create that gap. As a result, you're making kind of calculations about Stalingrad 42 really focuses your attention on counting factors and trying to bring the sufficient factors to combat to a particular hex to break that hex bond and break through. In 4 Blau, you're engaging in more combat. You're attacking all across the line with various units, and because of the combat rating factor, basically you don't know the combat strength of your units, you're not making those attack factor calculations. You're coming in with a unit with an unknown strength. You're engaging in combat. It's only when you engage in combat that you draw a strength chit, which determines the combat strength of the units you're attacking with, and sometimes the units that are defending in that hex. So whereas there's more sort of open information in Stalingrad 42, you know the strength of your units, you're counting these factors up, trying to bring 20 attack factors. In 4 Blau, there's an unknown, a fog of war, and you're often attacking along the line, hoping for breaks here and there. So Stalingrad 42 is more sort of mathematical, you're making calculations. 4 Blau is more fog of war element, the unknown, the uncertainty. You're not quite making those calculations, you're hoping for a good outcome. There are various stacking rules, which I won't go into. It's worth noting, though, that whereas in Stalingrad 42 you often have dense stacks of units, as you're trying to bring these combat factors into a combat, 4 Blau spreads the combat out, spreads the situation out, spreads the front out. You're only allowed to have, you can stack multiple units together, but you're only allowed to bring one multi-step unit or one step worth of multi-step units into a combat. I say one step worth because certain Panzer divisions are often counted as half steps. So when you have 2 named Panzer division regiments stacked together, they count as 1 unit for that purpose. The net effect, though, is to force you to spread your forces out and concentrate named Panzer divisions together, whereas Stalingrad 42 often encourages you to bring powerful stacks together. It has a different feel combined with the different scale that these games operate on, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. So as I said, that's the principal difference in the driving the feel of the game, which I'll talk about in just a moment. There are also differences in supply. In Stalingrad 42, you are advancing Axis railhead, so as the Soviets withdraw, the Axis moves their railhead markers up and advances the railhead. They're converting the rail lines. They need supply points principally for, well, you provide general supply to your units. They can't go out of supply or they begin to suffer attrition, lose steps. But you're also providing supply points for what are called artillery supply units, often your headquarters, and they provide critical column shifts in combat. So supply points for your artillery supply units to provide column shifts in combat is a key factor there. In 4 Blau, you have really, the rules don't make this differentiation, but you've really got 3 different types of supply. You've got general supply, where units must trace an unlimited line back to a supply source, or again, they become out of supply, isolated, begin to suffer attrition and step losses, similar to Stalingrad 42. But you've also got 2 other types of supply. You've got what you might think of as fuel supply for your mechanised divisions, motorised divisions, panzer divisions, and they need to draw that fuel supply from an activated headquarters. So one of the another defining feature of 4 Blau is the activation of headquarters. So you'll activate a headquarters, and a Panzer Corps headquarters can provide fuel for a number of named divisions within that corps. When they provide that fuel, those divisions can move at their full movement allowance. Now, I will point out that another key difference here between the games is the movement rates of units. In Stalingrad 42, units typically move up to 6, have a base movement rate of up to 6 movement points. In 4 Blau, your panzer divisions have a base movement rate of about 10 movement points. When given full supply, that means these units in 4 Blau are moving 10 hexes. But again, considering that the hexes are a smaller scale, those 10 hexes they're moving is about the same geographical distance as the 6 hexes moved in Stalingrad 42. So whilst it feels like you're moving more and you're making more careful decisions about what route to take, in practice you're moving the same distance as Stalingrad 42. But because there are far more hexes in that range, you're making more careful and more calculated decisions in 4 Blau. Stalingrad 42 is about bringing forces to bear in a hex or two to count your attack factors. 4 Blau is often about spreading your forces out, trying to poke gaps on the far left, on the far right. You've got a lot more hexes, a longer defensive line for the Soviets, and thus sort of more things to think about. And I'll point out the map differences in just a moment. But to get back to fuel supply. So with full fuel supply from an activated headquarters, and basically at the start of each turn, the Axis forces will have a number of supply points to allocate, or support points I should say, and they provide these support points to activate a headquarters. And once activated, those headquarters provide fuel to their panzer units, and that really supports your principal drive. And then you have combat supply. Now, infantry army headquarters provide combat supply for their infantry divisions. So infantry divisions don't need fuel like the panzer divisions, but they do need combat supply, and thus they need to be within the range of a supported infantry division headquarters to draw on that supply. So there's very interesting decisions that the Axis player is making in terms of support points and how they're using those support points to activate perhaps 4 key headquarters along the front in a certain location, and those headquarters are then activating panzer divisions for fuel to move rapidly and provide combat supply for their units to engage in combat. So that's some very important sort of command decisions that you're making in 4 Blau. Okay, let me talk about the maps, because I've kind of been hinting at this for quite a while. As I said, both of them have quite large footprints, but I want to focus your attention in particular on the area around Voronezh and to the south of Voronezh. So we're looking here at Stalingrad 42, and if we kind of count the hexes between sort of 2 key locations, in this case Svoboda and Veluki, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 hexes between Veluki and Svoboda on the Don River. Okay, so 9 hexes between those two. If I go to 4 Blau and we count the same distance between what is called Liski in this title, the same city in effect, Svoboda you can see just south of the river there, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So 15 hexes between the Don River and Veluki, between the same point on the Don River, Svoboda, Liski, and Veluki. So in effect, there are 50% more hexes in 4 Blau compared to Stalingrad 42. And again, that has a pretty significant implication for gameplay and aesthetics. That gap in Stalingrad 42, 9 hex gap, can be effectively covered by 5 units. They will create Zoc bonds between them. 9 hexes, you've got 5 units, 4 Zoc bonds locking in that area. Okay, so a relatively light density of units with stacks in those 5 hexes. In 4 Blau, you have zones of control, blocking movement, halting movement, but you are more likely to have, well, as I said, you've got 15 hexes, so more gaps, more space to maneuver, more decisions to make. It's more difficult for the Soviets to defend. They can't form those solid stacks that they're doing in Stalingrad 42. I have found my Soviet defensive strategies in Fall Blau to be very, very poor compared to Stalingrad 42, which is still poor, but not quite as poor. It's easier to form solid stacks in Stalingrad 42, easier to mount a Soviet defense compared to in Fall Blau, where these fast-moving panzer divisions can quite easily pick off the most vulnerable part of the line. With 10 movement points, you can quite easily move from the left-hand side of the line to the right-hand side of the line in Fall Blau within a single turn or close to it. Less so in Stalingrad 42. So bringing these two maps together. So again, Stalingrad 42 has fewer hexes covering a geographical area. Fall Blau has a lot more hexes covering the same geographical area. But if we bring the two together, we can see that they're very similar in their coverage of terrain effects. You can see the flow of the Don River through Voronezh, through Lysky, Svoboda, down towards Pavlovsk and to the south. That clear terrain between the two. You may notice the difference between the map aesthetics as well. Stalingrad 42 is a much simpler map design. There is a lot of clear terrain. The rivers play a key role, the major river, the Don, and minor rivers throughout, plus a scattering of forests or woods throughout. Not a great deal. There's principally that focus on clear terrain, which focuses your attention on defensive lines out in the open. Okay, principally you'll be fighting through clear terrain. You'll notice Fall Blau, it takes quite a different approach. It's colourful but not too bright. There is a lot of recognition of smaller wooded areas and mountainous regions. There's a more frequent use of roads throughout the map in Fall Blau, and terrain features can play a key role. So on defence, there are more, in this case, in this environment here, there are more hilly areas for the Soviets to defend in, and they provide critical defensive benefits in this otherwise clear environment. I don't want to say too much about my personal preferences, but I really like the map in Fall Blau. When you're playing on a physical copy, the units really stand out. The environment is very aesthetically pleasing, and compared to Stalingrad 42, it's a bit of a bland map. It's clear but bland, and your focus is more so on the units. You're not too bothered with. You're almost always fighting throughout clear terrain. But again, whilst they're different scales, they are very similar in their the orientation of rivers and the like. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about movement. Stalingrad 42 has your regular movement. There are options for extended movement. I think it's up to 3 additional hexes. There's options for tactical movement, 1 or 2 hexes in certain circumstances. Certain unit status effects restrict that as well. There's rail movement in Stalingrad 42 for both Soviets and Axis forces, and there's sea movement for the Soviets. In Fall Blau, you have regular movement, which is referred to as tactical movement. You're based on normal movement rates. Then you have strategic movement, and this is pretty critical. You need to stay away from enemy forces when conducting this movement, but it's very beneficial because of the large ground that you're often covering. Again, talking about 15 hexes between the Don and the front lines. So using that strategic movement to get your slower infantry divisions, which have a movement rate of 6, close to the front is pretty important. There are also rules for mobile infiltration, where you can infiltrate through enemy lines. You can't do that in Stalingrad 42. There are rules for overrun and mobile assault, so you're conducting a sort of an offensive along the way to force a defender to retreat. There are also rules in Fall Blau for rail movement for the Soviets only. No Axis rail movement, and sea movement for the Soviets as well across the Black Sea. Now, the zone of control rules in both titles is another defining factor, principally the use of those hex bonds. So if you're familiar with the 19XX hex bond system, you'll know how Stalingrad 42 works, and it is a defining feature of that title. The use of hex bonds creates a lighter unit density and abstracts your decision making in a certain way. I respect a lot of people don't like that. I'm a big fan of that system. I love the hex bond system and the decisions that it fuels. You must stop on entering an enemy zone of control, and it costs an additional 2 movement points to leave an enemy zone of control. In full Blau, of course, there is no hex bond system. You still stop on entering an enemy zone of control, plus 2 movement points to leave an enemy zone of control, but no hex bond system. Again, just creates those differences. You're making different types of decisions, attacking across a broad front rather than a focused attack as you do in Stalingrad 42. Just differences in the way the design decisions play out. There are differences in combat as well. So Stalingrad 42 features a D6 based system. There are combat modifiers for tank shifts, elite tank shifts, air support, artillery, as I mentioned, and various terrain effects which can halve and provide shifts and provide modifiers. Okay, so quite a variation of shifts and modifiers in Stalingrad 42. Full Blau uses a D10 based combat system on a CRT. There are various shifts, but they are principally column shifts. For most combat effects, you're shifting left or right, so it's nice just to focus on those column shifts. You get combined arms shifts for bringing armour to combat with infantry. You get air support, and there are a lot of terrain effects shifts as well. It's difficult to compare the CRTs between the two because one is D6 based, one is D10 based. They use different modifiers, but just looking at the results at the CRTs, and if we take 3 examples, 1-to-1 odds, 3-to-1 odds, and 5-to-1 odds. At 1-to-1 odds, if the Axis forces are attacking Soviet forces at 1-to-1, in Stalingrad 42, you've got an 83% chance of suffering an attacker step loss. In Full Blau, you've only got a 60% chance of suffering a step loss. Okay. At 3-to-1 odds in Stalingrad 42, you've got a 50% chance of suffering a step loss. In Full Blau, it's only a 30% chance of suffering an attacker step loss. At 5-to-1 odds in Stalingrad 42, 33% chance of suffering an attacker step loss at 5-to-1. In Full Blau, it's only 20%. So my conclusion from this is that Full Blau is more attacker friendly. You are less likely to suffer attacker step losses based on the combat system in Full Blau, putting all modifiers aside. Okay, so it's hard to say how this all balances out in combat. As I said, you're making very many different decisions. In Full Blau, you're often attacking all across the line, often at lower odds or a mix of odds in Full Blau. If you take the exact same situation, the opening offensive, Full Blau, you're attacking all across the line. In Stalingrad 42, you might just be attacking in several key locations, and you'll be trying to bring greater strength to those combats. I think the difference in the CRT, in the implications for attacker losses, reflects the different thinking around combat. Again, Stalingrad 42, you're looking at those focused combats to break through big gaps. In Full Blau, you're looking at multiple combats in order to break through, and so it's more attacker friendly for that reason. If you're conducting 3 combats at 20% chance of a loss, do the maths, and you probably work out about the same odds of taking a loss in both games. In terms of retreat rules, another defining feature of Stalingrad 42 is that a determined defence is possible in certain circumstances, where the defender can hold their ground but they risk suffering additional losses and failing. Stalingrad 42 also has additional unit statuses, so you have disrupted and full retreat status for defending units based on their combat result. These status effects reduce movement, affect your combat effects, may affect your zones of control as well. You need to recover that during a recovery phase. One of the things I love about Stalingrad 42 and some other 19XX titles is the use of breakthrough combat. So if you get a certain result on the CRT, you can form a stack and perform an additional breakthrough combat. It's a great feature of Stalingrad 42, which really helps create a sense of breaking through. Full Blau is much simpler. There are just retreat rules. you've got mobile assault retreats where the attacker chooses where the defender retreats to, but for most combat, the defender retreats usually up to 3 hexes, sometimes 4, in exceptional circumstances. But they just follow a retreat path and there's an advance after combat. No determined defense and no other status effects that affect units such as in Stalingrad 42. So you can fair to say that Stalingrad 42 has a bit of extra rules flavour here, a couple of extra decision points here, decision point in making a determined defence, decision point in looking for, again, trying to bring factors to find a column where you can potentially get that breakthrough combat. So sometimes you're looking for a breakthrough combat and you're looking to bring sufficient factors to get that breakthrough combat, extra decision making. And then you've got the breakthrough combat, extra decisions for where you advance to and where you conduct that breakthrough combat. So several additional decision points. In full Blau, it's more of a massed attack quite effect. You're attacking here at these odds, you're attacking here at these odds, you're attacking here at these odds, retreat, retreat, retreat. So a simpler process, but on a broader scale. There's more combat going on in full Blau, typically. In terms of victory and what you're striving for, Stalingrad 42 uses a victory point benchmark system. The Axis player is striving to adhere close to that benchmark and ideally exceed it by, I think, 6 victory points or more. If they exceed that benchmark by a certain margin, they secure an automatic victory. If they fall behind that benchmark by a certain margin, the Soviets get an automatic victory. So the Axis player has to ensure they're keeping to that historical schedule. For Blau, has an automatic victory condition using what's called the Hitler gold chits. So every couple of turns, every dozen turns or so, you'll draw a Hitler gold chit, and that's your objective for your offensive. Hitler might say, all right, I want you to capture certain regions in the Caucasus and you must drive towards that. And if you succeed in doing so, if you meet that objective, the Axis player automatically wins the game. But every 10 dozen turns or so, this may change. You'll draw a new chit, a new objective. So you're kind of in a race for time to achieve that objective as quickly as possible. If you can achieve this quick objective, the Axis player wins the game. Failing to do so, it's a race for victory points, and you're accumulating victory points throughout and trying to, get a certain victory point margin to secure victory. Both games are very, very highly replayable. There are lots of options and variants in both titles. In Stalingrad 42, you've got options for reserve, placing units in reserve, planned offensives, disengagement. There are options for leaders and contested city battles, among others. In full Blau, there's probably a greater range of options. A lot of them are sort of minor options scattered throughout the rulebook. I divide these into 3. There are historical options that make the game a little bit more complex that you can adhere to if you want to stick to history. Things like sticking to historical support points and historical limitations on support, things like that. Then there are what I call operational options. So depending on the scenario you're doing, if you're doing a full campaign, you can engage in, you can sort of buy operational options to release reserves earlier, to direct forces to certain areas of the map, and they cost you victory points if you want to buy those options in a sense. And finally, there are additional gameplay options, not necessarily called historical options, just gameplay options that change the flavour of the game a little bit. Things like the Soviets are allowed to build defensive works during the course of the campaign, whereas otherwise they aren't by the normal rules. And all those little options and rules create slightly different themes and flavours for the games. It's fair to say full Blau has a greater range of scenarios. They've got 6 smaller scenarios and 3 larger campaign scenarios, but there's enough gameplay in both of these to keep you gaming for a long time. It's also worth pointing out, and perhaps a critical factor here, is that full Blau originally retailed for about $150 which in Australian is about 240 Australian dollars. Whereas Stalingrad 42 is roughly half that price at $75 about 120, 140 Australian dollars. So full Blau was originally almost twice the price of Stalingrad 42. Full Blau comes with 980 counters, a lot more than Stalingrad 42, but I can't recall exactly how many is in Stalingrad 42, but the net effect is full Blau has a lot more counters, greater counter density, and has more of a monster feel just because the conflict spreads, and there's a lot more going on in these smaller hexes over a greater sort of map footprint. Whereas Stalingrad 42 looks and kind of feels not quite as monstrous, more manageable. As I said, you often focus on particular combat, smaller stacks, or more focused stacks, I should say. And even when playing Stalingrad 42, I wouldn't really describe it as a monster game. It's a big game, maybe a mini monster perhaps, but for Blau certainly feels more monstrous and larger. There's more components, more maps in For Blau. My point here is For Blau is twice as expensive. You get more in it, but it's out of print and could be difficult to find. Whereas Stalingrad 42, as a more recent publication by GMT, is more readily available. So that might be the key factor for you: price and availability. Or you may just prefer the bigger monstrous feel of For Blau and want to pursue that instead. Now, if you're familiar with Mark Simich's 19x6 series, it's very easy to get into Stalingrad 42. Most 80% of the rules are the same, so that may be a factor driving you towards Stalingrad 42. If you want more of a traditional, if you don't like the hexbond system, and you want more of that traditional hex encounter idea, you might want to shift towards For Blau. If you don't like, or if you do like factor counting, and I do like factor counting, I don't mind counting up factors, particularly when playing solo. Stalingrad 42 has a lot of that factor counting, whereas For Blau has the fog of war element, which can work well for solo play or two-handed play. Yeah, you've got that unknown combat rating element in For Blau. In terms of gameplay duration, because of the lighter counter density, because of the more focused combat, I found, and the larger scale of the hexes, I found Stalingrad 42 plays much more quickly than For Blau because of the speed of the decisions I'm often making in Stalingrad 42. If I know I want to attack here, I can bring forces there quite quickly. In For Blau, it's often taking me longer to move because I'm thinking very carefully about where to concentrate my forces, and you might need to move forces from the rear to cover your front, to cover your flank, to then move these forces up and beyond, and then you conduct some mobile assaults along the way to try and clear a gap. There's a lot more decision making going on in a typical turn of For Blau. Okay, so although the rules are, I would say, fractionally lighter in For Blau in terms of movement and combat rules and retreats and all this, you're making more decisions, and you need to be more careful with the decisions you make in For Blau because there's, again, as I probably repeated a couple of times, there's more going on over that same sort of geographical area compared to Stalingrad 42. That's not to diminish the value of the decisions you're making in Stalingrad 42. They're different decisions. As I said, there are additional decision points. Determined defense, breakthrough, the status of defending units, whether they're in full retreat or disrupted and so forth, things like that. But they're quicker decisions to make. They're still quite interesting decisions. They're quite complex. A lot of factors to consider with your tank shifts, your elite tank shifts. Terrain features are more important in For Blau as well. So Soviets are making more critical decisions about defending. There's a lot I haven't mentioned about both titles as well. I'm really trying to focus on the flavour. So in For Blau, there's this whole Soviet units are more tied to the front line. There's a Soviet commitment roll that you make to release those units. I haven't really gone over the details there. That also shapes the feeling of For Blau. I think my personal opinion is that For Blau has a couple of additional historical tweaks. The Bryansk front rules, that commitment roll, which kind of tie it more to history. So if you're a stickler for history and you want more of a simulation, you might want to lean more towards For Blau. Again, despite being marginally lighter in rules, For Blau has these extra little historical elements that give it that historical flavour. Whereas Stalingrad 42, a little bit lighter and more, the rules are more aimed towards gameplay decisions and so it's quick gameplay, relatively speaking, but yeah, interesting decisions with various factors shaping those decisions. So, as I've said in my recent review for Blau, they are both keepers. They both offer different things, and they have different feelings in their gameplay. So, if you can, pick them both up. Hopefully, what I've covered in this video has helped illuminate how they're special and peculiar in their own different ways. They offer pros and cons in different ways. Yeah, so if you can, get your hand on both. Thanks for watching, everyone, and take care.